Thank you for inviting me to speak. I am Dirk Rodjers, an independent consultant from Dublin, Ohio in the United States. Slide 3 is the agenda for this presentation. I am going to start out by providing you with some statistics about the pharmaceutical supply chain in the United States. Then I will provide some historical background about the U.S. drug supply chain. Then I will discuss the brand new U.S. federal law that was just enacted 2 weeks ago, known as the Drug Quality and Security Act, or DQSA. Finally, I will talk about the anticipated standards and technologies companies are likely to use to meet the new U.S. DQSA law, and then we will try to fit in some questions if possible. Slide 4 contains some facts about from 2011 about the U.S. pharmaceutical supply chain provided by the Healthcare Distribution Management Association and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. In that year, U.S. pharmacies filled more than 4 billion prescriptions. 55% of those prescriptions were filled by chain drugstores or by mass merchandise stores. The total pharmaceutical market in the U.S. was $319.9 billion in 2011, and the market was growing at about 4% each year. The top 20 therapeutic drug classes comprised nearly 50% of total drug sales. Just 3 wholesale distributors handle 87% of all drugs distributed in the United States. U.S. wholesale distributors inventoried an average of 24,377 different drug stock keeping units. An SKU is an individual inventoried product number. The average distribution center handled 2,738 orders per day, and in the United States, 80% of drug APIs are imported, while 40% of finished drugs are imported. You can see that Americans consume a large quantity of prescription medicines. In the United States, the drug supply chain is very large. Now let's take a look at the history of the U.S. drug supply chain, with particular emphasis on the history of supply chain crimes and track and trace regulations designed to fight those crimes. As depicted on slide 6, way back in 1987, the U.S. Congress enacted the Prescription Drug Marketing Act, which was primarily aimed at addressing drug diversion that a few drug wholesale distributors were engaging in at the time. This was prior to the consolidation of the wholesale business into the big 3 wholesalers that exist today. Back then, there were many hundreds of regional distributors, and none covered the entire country. The main provision of the federal PDMA was that each person who engaged in the wholesale distribution of drugs and who is not an authorized distributor of record of such drugs shall provide each wholesale distributor of such drugs a statement identifying each sale of the drug, including the date of the sale, before the sale to such wholesale distributor. Basically, whenever a wholesale distributor that was not authorized by the manufacturer to sell their drugs somehow acquired some of those drugs, Congress wanted that distributor to document exactly how they came to acquire those drugs in the first place. This became known as a drug pedigree. The problem was the technology necessary to implement such a burdensome regulation did not yet exist in 1987, so the law went through many delays. Finally, in December of 2006, the law finally went into effect, but 2 days later, a small wholesale distributor filed suit in federal court to contest some of the key provisions contained in the law. The judge blocked the FDA from enforcing those specific provisions until the lawsuit could be resolved. The suit was later terminated when the FDA agreed to never enforce those provisions, and so they never have. Meanwhile, around 1998, some criminals in the state of Florida discovered that it was very easy to obtain legitimate pharmaceutical wholesale distributors' licenses that allowed them to buy and sell bulk quantities of pharmaceuticals, as shown on slide 7. They began selling diverted drugs to the large and growing legitimate wholesale distributors, and they made a lot of money in a short amount of time, just what criminals like about their jobs. As demand for their supply of drugs increased, they began selling counterfeit and up-labeled pharmaceuticals. All of this illegal activity was hidden from view because, remember, the federal PDMA was not yet in effect. Eventually, adverse reactions began to be reported by patients across the nation. Investigators found that the drugs that caused these adverse events were counterfeit, but they had difficulty figuring out exactly where they came from and who had introduced them into the legitimate supply chain. As a result, state governments became very concerned that the repeated delays in the effective date of the federal PDMA was enabling these crimes and keeping the criminals hidden. As shown on slide 8, in 2003, the state of Florida decided to create their own pharmaceutical pedigree law. The state legislature enacted a law that required drug wholesale distributors within the state to provide what they called pedigree papers to their customers. Large wholesalers who bought drugs directly from the manufacturer were allowed to avoid the burden by simply placing a statement on their invoices indicating that they bought the drugs directly from the manufacturer. So the law primarily impacted small distributors. The law allowed companies to provide their pedigrees electronically if they wanted to. Companies providing drugs were required to authenticate the pedigrees they received to confirm that they were not forged. This law did not require any kind of unit-level serialization, so it required companies to keep track of the supply chain history by keeping each incoming shipment segregated from each other. The law went into effect on July 1, 2006. As shown on slide 9, in 2004, the California State Legislature enacted their own pharmaceutical pedigree law, which was to require drug manufacturers to place unique serial numbers on each drug package and start an electronic pedigree. They were to do this for 50% of their drugs by January 1, 2015, and the remainder by January 1, 2016. Wholesale distributors and repackagers were to read those serial numbers when they received drugs and confirmed that they also received a matching electronic pedigree for those same serial numbers. Expected to update the pedigrees and pass them along to their customers, all by July of 2016. Pharmacies were to read these serial numbers when they received drugs and confirm that they received an authentic pedigree by July of 2017. The industry planned to use GS1 standards to implement the required electronic pedigree. The California law was delayed several times until in 2008 when they finally settled on the dates that are shown on this slide. I will explain in a minute why this law now no longer exists. In 2003, a 16-year-old boy in the state of New York was prescribed Epigen, a drug he needed to fight off rejection after a liver transplant. After weeks of injecting the drug with success, the boy began experiencing serious adverse reactions whenever the drug was injected. The Epigen turned out to be counterfeit, containing only 5% of the concentration stated on the label, and it was supplied by a very reputable pharmacy chain. Worse, even after the first counterfeit drug was discovered and removed, the Epigen the pharmacy provided as a replacement also turned out to be counterfeit. As you can imagine, this case became very high profile, and it got the attention of Elliot Spitzer, who was then the Attorney General of the state of New York, as shown on slide 10. His office investigated the industry in 2005 and found that the three big wholesale distributors, who had now consolidated into the three large nationwide distributors we have here today, were all buying some of their inventory from the secondary or gray market. This is how the alleged Epigen had allegedly been brought into the legitimate supply chain. In 2006, one of the big three distributors paid a settlement of $11 million to the state of New York and agreed to close their secondary sourcing business unit. The other two big distributors quickly followed by shutting their own secondary sourcing businesses too. By this time, these three companies handled about 80% of the drugs distributed in the United States. All three announced that they would no longer buy inventory from the secondary market. This eliminated the open door criminals found into the legitimate national drug distribution network, and it appears to be what has caused a sharp drop in the number of counterfeit drugs found in our supply chain since then. I want to pause the history for a moment to explain with slide 11 what it is that U.S. drug pedigree laws were trying to accomplish. First, they were attempting to detect the introduction of illegitimate drugs, which includes counterfeit, stolen, up-labeled, and diverted drugs, into the legitimate supply chain as early as possible, preferably at the very first transaction. Second, they were trying to identify exactly who participated in the introduction. And third, they were trying to help with the prosecution of criminals by automatically generating solid evidence that could be used in their trial. Overall, pedigrees protect patients by protecting the supply chain from criminal activity. If a criminal cannot introduce illegitimate drugs into the supply chain covertly, then the drugs provided to patients from that supply chain should be legitimate and safe. As shown on slide 12, eventually about 30 U.S. states adopted a drug pedigree law of one type or another. None were as complex for the industry as the California law. This map shows the status of those states' laws as of the beginning of this year. The requirements contained in those 30 state pedigree laws were all a little different as explained on slide 13. Dealing with the levels of accuracy necessary to maintain a pedigree system introduced significant inefficiencies into supply chain operations. The industry grew increasingly concerned about these inefficiencies, especially those introduced by the California law. Remember, by this time, the wholesale distributors had consolidated mostly into just three large companies who distributed pharmaceuticals into every state. And one of the reasons pedigree laws were originally enacted was now solved with the end of secondary sourcing practices of these three large wholesalers. This led the industry to band together to form a new organization called the Prescription Drug Security Alliance in 2010. The sole purpose of the PDSA was to lobby the U.S. Congress to pass a federal law that would nationalize pharma supply chain regulations and preempt all state drug pedigree laws. 2 weeks ago, on November 27th, that effort was successful when President Obama signed the congressional act known as the Drug Quality and Security Act into law. This law immediately results in all existing state pharmaceutical pedigree laws becoming inoperative, and it imposes new, uniform, nationwide regulations that start on January 1st, 2015. So let's take a closer look at that new law. Slide 15 shows that the new law contains two major phases. First, for the first 10 years, there will be an initial lot-based pedigree or electronic pedigree system in place, and after 10 years, there will be a unit-level serialization-based interoperable electronic-only track and trace system in place. The preemption of all existing state and federal pedigree laws is one of the most important provisions to the industry. There is a long list of exemptions, which includes all of those that came from the California pedigree law. Small companies may apply to the FDA for exemption from the law if they can prove a financial hardship. Supply chain parties must hold a state or federal license to participate in the supply chain after January 1st, 2015. The law contains a new federal licensing program and new requirements for wholesale distributors and third-party logistics providers. The new federal law is a lot like a combination of the Florida state law and the California state law, but as shown on slide 16, the authors seem to go to great lengths to not use the word pedigree. Instead, they defined three different types of documents that drug sellers in the supply chain must provide to their customers. These are called transaction information, transaction history, and transaction statement. The transaction information contains a description of the current single transaction that resulted in a change of ownership of the drug. The transaction history is the full set of transaction information for each transaction prior to the current one, going back to the manufacturer, the repackager, or to the first wholesale distributor, depending on circumstances. The transaction history will only be necessary in the first phase. The transaction statement is a statement of compliance with the DQSA for the current single transaction. For brevity, I refer to these three components as TransX. Slide 17 shows that Phase 1 of the DQSA will last for the next 10 years. This is the lot-based pedigree, or TransX phase. Even though serial numbers are not part of the TransX data exchange in Phase 1, manufacturers who wish to continue marketing their pharmaceuticals in the United States must encode the National Drug Code, lot number, and expiration date within a 2D data matrix barcode within the next 4 years. Remember, the California law would have required drugs entering that state to be serialized between 2015 and 2016, so this provides manufacturers with a little more time. But again, because no one is required to make use of those serial numbers until late 2023, the extra time can be used to make sure everything regarding serialization is operating smoothly. During Phase 1, serial numbers do not need to be placed into the TransX documents, but parties in the supply chain must implement a way to investigate and quarantine suspect drugs. TransX documents must be exchanged in either paper or electronic form, but after 4 years, manufacturers must begin sending their information only electronically. TransX documents must be passed downstream starting on January 1st, 2015, which is what makes this a true pedigree law. The law gives the U.S. FDA 1 year to publish guidance for formatting and exchanging the TransX documents. That is not a lot of time, and because companies must begin passing TransX documents in only 13 months from now, everyone is assuming the FDA will be forced to embrace existing ways of passing information, including things like paper packing lists and existing EDI, or electronic data interchange. Slide 18 shows that concurrent with the operation of Phase 1, the DQSA requires the U.S. FDA to hold at least 5 meetings with industry stakeholders to collect input on various topics, including scalability and capacity, system attributes, best practices, costs and benefits, whether or not electronic tracing at package level is feasible, cost-effective, and needed to protect the public, systems and processes including aggregation and inference, technical capabilities and legal authorities needed, impact on patient safety, drug supply, cost burden, and effect on drug access to drugs. In addition, the FDA is required to conduct at least one pilot with companies in the supply chain to test the technology that will be introduced into Phase 2. As shown on slide 19, in 10 years, Phase 2 will begin. The law does not provide a lot of detail around everything that must happen in Phase 2 except for some large concepts, leaving the details to the FDA to fill in over the next 10 years. First of all, the transaction history will no longer be needed in the information that sellers provide to customers, but the serial numbers on each package of drugs in the shipments must be included in the remaining TransX documents that are provided. The data must be saved by each party for 6 years to assist with investigations. These simple changes transform the operation from a pedigree system to what is called a one-up, one-down data system where no company gets the full history. But because it will then be fully based on package-level serial numbers, the assumption is that investigations into drugs that are discovered to be suspect will be very quick and easy. Slide 20 is a timeline of major events comparing those of the DQSA with those of the California state law that it preempts. On this slide, the DQSA is called by its pre-enactment congressional numbering, H.R. 3204. Finally, I have a couple of slides that discuss the anticipated standards and technology for meeting the DQSA law. As I said earlier, the FDA will publish technology guidelines sometime next year. Slide 22 shows that back in 2010, the FDA already published guidelines that sanctioned GS1's GTIN plus serial number construct for pharma serialization. Larger companies are currently interested in using GS1's Electronic Product Code Information Services, or EPCIS standard for electronic TransX data retention and exchange. Larger drug wholesale distributors may provide small pharmacy customers with cloud-based data retention and exchange capability at little or no cost, which the law explicitly allows. GS1 US is very active regarding the DQSA, providing guidance on the application of GS1 standards for meeting the law. GS1 Healthcare US members include many of the larger companies in the US healthcare supply chains. Why is the US pharma industry so interested in GS1 standards for meeting the DQSA? As shown on slide 23, the answer is that the pharma industry is now truly global, and GS1 standards are ideal because they are globally interoperable and globally accepted. That is, they are used in many countries around the world, and they work the same way everywhere. They offer a single global format for serial numbers and carrier technologies. This is the GS1 Electronic Product Code, or EPC, which can be carried in many different kinds of barcodes and 2 different kinds of RFID tags. And they offer a single data exchange and retention format for all serial number-based supply chain events, and that is the GS1 EPCIS standard. That completes my presentation. Thank you.